My name is Delaine Anderson. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a current second year Master of Public Health student at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Along with Kendall Lucero, a second year Masters of Public Health student at the University of Illinois, Chicago, we will be facilitating tonight's panel. A few reminders and housekeeping tips before we get started. Please note that we are recording this webinar, which will be posted on the event website where you'll be able to find this and other materials on this topic. To enable captions for today's event, please click the CC button on the Zoom menu. As well, throughout tonight's webinar, we encourage you to use the chat function to submit questions that you may have for the panelists for our Q&A later tonight. As participants, you will only be able to chat with the hosts rather than chatting with everyone, and you can find links to the speakers' bios at the link shared in the chat. We want to take a moment to thank all the people that made today possible. It has been an absolute delight working on this event, which is brought to you by a collaboration made up of many folks. It's been made up of the University of Minnesota's Just Education Research Collaborative, which is addressing the ripple effect of incarceration in Minnesota, the University of Minnesota and Illinois Chicago Maternal and Child Health Interest Groups, and the University of Illinois Chicago and University of Minnesota Centers of Excellence in Maternal and Child Health Education, Science, and Practice, which are funded through the Maternal and Child Health Bureau of the Human Resources and Service Administration. That's a big old mouthful, but it's very important and integral to our success of putting on this panel and getting all of you lovely folks joining us here tonight. Before we get started today, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the lands that we are on. While we're gathered virtually, it's important to acknowledge that our institutions are situated on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. In Minnesota, we're gathering on the land of the Dakota. The University of Illinois Chicago inhabits the original homelands of the Three Fires people, the Potawatomi, the Odawa, and the Ojibwe, and other tribal nations such as the Menominee and Ho-Chunk. We acknowledge and honor the original peoples of the Chicagoland area and the many Indigenous peoples who call it home, past, present, and future. We're taking this moment to honor their histories, languages, and cultures, and invite you to do the same wherever you're joining in from. A link has been shared in the chat that will allow you to identify the land that you are currently on. Before my peer Chinenwa leads our radical welcome, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that today's topic is a heavy and traumatic one. I know that there are many of us here today directly impacted by our incarceration ourselves or in our families, neighborhoods, and communities. We specifically want to thank you for spending your evening with us, despite the grief and hurt each of you may feel. Part of the work of addressing injustice is the painful acknowledgement and conversations we must have together. We encourage you to be mindful of how you feel and where you may need to take breaks or leave altogether. We support you and we thank you for the energy you are sharing today in whatever way that may be. Chinenwa, would you like to begin our radical welcome?
I am going to take a minute to welcome our full selves. I welcome all of the ways that you have arrived here today. I want to welcome all of the parts of you that are still arriving, and all of the ways that we have been arriving for a long time. I want to welcome those whose families go back multiple generations in this region, and those who began. Welcome to those who are newcomers, and to those who have left and are returning. Welcome to those who feel home in this region, those who feel it's in another place, and those who aren't sure where home is. I want to welcome each and every one of you, your ethnic, racial, and ancestral backgrounds, and to the ways in which they define and shape us, and all of the ways in which you are connected and not connected to them. Welcome to all of the gender expressions of yourselves, and to all of the ways that each of you expresses your sexuality. Welcome to your religious faiths and spiritual practices, traditions, and to those who choose not to hold a practice. Welcome to the questions, the doubts, and the searching. Welcome to each of you across all ages. Welcome to the ways in which your numerical age speaks to your particular wisdom in this moment in time, and the ways in which each of you moves outside of them. Welcome to the work that each of you does in the world. Welcome to the ways in which that may or may not define you. Welcome to those who might call themselves change makers, and those of you who might use the term does not resonate. Welcome to the educators in each of you, and to the learners in each of you. Each of you are welcome. Welcome to your minds and to your intellects. Welcome to your bodies, the unique container that each of you sits in, and all of the forms you show up in. Welcome to the parts of you that are comfortable right now, and to the places of discomfort or diseases. Welcome to the parts of you that feel very human, and to the parts of you that are interconnected to the universe. All of that is welcome here. Welcome to all of these parts of ourselves, what we have named and not named. The invitation is to be here, not to escape the world, not to retreat away from it, but to meet in it ourselves and each other, and in what we create together. Thank you.
Thank you, Chinenwa, and thank you to all of us here today. What a wonderful way to begin our time together in this space. We want to start today by sharing the Emmy award-winning Belly of the Beast movie trailer with you to provide some background on this topic. I know many of you are joining us today with considerable expertise on this topic, and others may just be beginning to think about mass incarceration and its impact on pregnant and postpartum people. Given that, we want to provide just a bit of background on this topic before we turn to our panelists.
There is a culture of secrecy in California.
I have some fear. What kind of repercussions will I get for coming on and talking about this?
I've always been a fighter, but it wasn't truly birthed until I was in prison.
They did a pelvic exam.
He said I had a fibroid.
I was told that I had cancer cells.
When I came out, I felt like something was wrong.
We were getting hundreds of letters about medical abuses every month.
When was the first time a doctor told you that you may be missing your ovaries?
No one ever told me that.
I had been intentionally sterilized, and I had been lied to.
The law prohibits sterilizing people in prison for the purpose of birth control, but they were doing it anyway.
One of the challenges with this story is you ultimately have to get to intent. And then that's when the doctor said, well, that's cheaper than welfare.
I was looking at these documents that was confirming, as a Black woman, my life wasn't shit.
what's going on.
I was very much intimidated by whom I was going up against.
The state has admitted that they have done these illegal surgeries, but we don't actually know who they did them on.
Women's become numbers. You don't get names. And that's what makes it easy to abuse them.
Women in California being coercively sterilized is absolutely revolting.
After all this pain, I'll never be the same.
We have yet to get an apology. We have yet to be acknowledged. The state has to be made accountable.
'Cause some wounds never heal. Do you see what you've done?
The goal of the panel today is to provide each of you with knowledge about how to move beyond conversation, to action, fulfilling director-producer Erica Cohn's vision of using the film to create a rallying point to call attention to other instances of modern-day eugenics and reproductive injustice. As a reminder, you have 2 more days to watch the screening for The Belly of the Beast. Please check your registration email from Zoom for the viewing instructions. Now, let us dive into our panel. The chat box is open for your questions. Please enter them as you have them, and we will share with the panelists later tonight during our Q&A. Tonight, we have 3 phenomenal individuals with us who have very different experiences within the carceral system: Autumn Mason, Cynthia Chandler, and Liz Feldman. Could each of you share a bit more about yourselves, including your preferred pronouns, your professional and personal experiences, and how these have informed or are currently informing your work in reproductive justice? Autumn, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Delaine, and thanks for inviting me on this magnificent panel. My name is Autumn Mason. I am a family trauma recovery coach, a peer support professional, and an incarceration survivor myself. Working with the Minnesota Prison Doula Project here in Minnesota has allowed me to be involved in the passing and implementation of the new Healthy Start Act, which was just passed this past spring, and has also allowed me to work directly with incarcerated women who are in the facilities, state and local facilities in Minnesota. So I have both a personal and professional investment in the fair and humane treatment of justice impacted women like myself, and reproductive justice as well. And I go by this he, she, her, and hers. Thank you.
I'll go next, I guess. Hi, I'm Cynthia Chandler. I go by she, her. I'm an attorney in California. And I've worked the last 20 years to both uncover and stop sterilization abuses inside California's prisons, as well as other forms of harm to the broader right to family of people targeted for imprisonment. And I drafted legislation passed in 2014 in California that was a sunshine statute to make it clear that there's a prohibition in our state, and I would argue federally, against doing sterilizations for the purpose of birth control on people in prison, and making that much more difficult to get away with in California by requiring public data collection, as well as a statute that was just passed in California, making California the 3rd state to provide reparations to people historically sterilized under state eugenics laws, as well as the 1st state in the country to provide reparations for contemporary sterilization abuses in prisons, as well as to mandate a right to disclosure of people sterilized in prisons to have a right to know if they're sterilized.
Thanks, you guys. I'm Liz Feldman. I'm a family physician by training and started my career working in adolescent medicine and family planning services in school-based health centers, which is where I sort of cut my teeth on learning about reproductive justice and reproductive agency. And then through a whole unusual series of circumstances, which basically was finding myself interested in working with different vulnerable populations, I joined the team at CIRMAC Health Services, which is the health services that provides care for folks that are incarcerated at the Cook County Jail. And so for 9 years, I learned from my patients at the Cook County Jail. And one of the populations that I was entrusted with caring for was several tiers or housing unit of women who were in a treatment program for women with co-occurring disorders, women with both mental health and substance abuse issues. So I really learned from my patients what they needed and what they wanted. And during that period of time, we started a family planning clinic at the Cook County Jail for women anticipating release. And we worked for Cook County Hospital. We did not work for the Cook County Department of Corrections. And I'll talk more about that later, but I think that's a really critical difference. So we worked with the OBGYN team and the family medicine teams that worked in the outpatient clinic at Cook County Hospital, and we were one of their satellites. And so I learned from my patients what they wanted and they asked for and they needed there. So that's the perspective that I'm bringing to this amazing panel tonight.
It is such an honor to have each of you with us tonight. I've been looking forward to this in our planning and we're finally here. So our first question. Oh,
pronouns, I apologize. Thank you.
No problem. So tonight, a major theme of The Belly of the Beast is reproductive injustices within the carceral system. In each of your roles or professions, how have you worked towards reproductive justice within the carceral system? What have been the biggest barriers or hurdles in doing this work? And Cynthia, you look like you want to start.
Oops, sorry. No, I think I was giggling because I was realizing that my answer to this question really highlights something that I failed to put in my introduction, which is that first and foremost, I really identify as a prison industrial complex abolitionist. And while I've been working on sterilization abuse issues for 20 years, for 35 years, I've been working to rebuild the abolitionist movement in the United States. And initially as a lawyer, I started off doing work around premature death and dying in prisons and helped create the compassionate release process and codified that in California and then spread that across the country, which is the process to allow people who are terminally ill the chance to be able to get out, either to die with dignity and reunite with their families, or ideally to access care. Okay, but why that's relevant is that to me, the biggest barrier to reproductive justice in the carceral setting is the carceral setting. And I think it's really important to note that prisons and other forms of total institutions function sort of like a form of institutional Nora plant, which if folks don't know what that is, that's like a contraceptive that's like put in your arm. And once it's in there, you can't really easily take it out unless you cut yourself open, right? And what I mean by the institution functioning that way is that we're removing people from their communities, putting them into an environment where sexual activity is at least ostensibly illegal, with the intention, right? And the deliberate design of removing people from the ability to reproduce. And for women who are more and more facing longer sentences for minor crimes of survival during their reproductive years, in effect, we are sterilizing people through and destroying their reproductive capacity by targeting their communities for imprisonment and then locking them up through their reproductive years and isolating them from their communities. And that lesson I learned from people in prison over and over and over again when talking about reproductive justice and talking about the right to family. People inside would mention over and over again how they had wished to have had more children. They had wished to be able to have love, to have families, to have lives, to be with the children they already had. And all of that was ripped apart because of the term of imprisonment. So anyway, my commitment to abolition is in part because of my commitment to reproductive justice. And I see prisons as fundamentally, as institutions, sort of a vector of destruction of reproductive capacity.
So Cynthia, if you're done, I'll jump in after you. I really appreciate a lot of what you said. So I agree. The biggest threat and the biggest hurdle is, in my opinion and my experience, has been the justice system, the carceral system itself. Trying to come into a system that has been only known to continue to oppress women in my condition, and to exploit our need for support in so many ways. I've seen so many women re-traumatized by the system that it's really sad. And it's also been something that has really motivated me to continue to do this work. So yes, the current system, the lack of empathy and humanity amongst those in a position of administration, the lack of adequate services, particular mental health, addiction, and trauma recovery. And like you said, most women who are in this prime of their life have committed crimes of survival. And most of those women have minor children and dependents who are depending on them. And because they have been removed from the family, it causes a continual trauma within the children as well. And so this cycle just continues to repeat itself. And until we're able to continue to have and expand on conversations like these, and to talk about the uncomfortable situations that have been in our past and address those, things will continue to go in this direction. So I try to use my voice as much as possible from my experience and the experience of others that I've worked with now to bring awareness, because I say all the time in any opportunity I have, before I was personally incarcerated, I hadn't considered either what the treatment of women like myself were. And so I think the first thing is bringing awareness, changing the mindsets of our community and our society to understand that these people are people and deserve to have their same human rights as everyone else.
Autumn, could you share for potentially folks who aren't as familiar what you mean by crimes of survival?
Yeah, so most women that I've found, that I've worked with and that studies have shown that are in their childbirthing years have been committed for crimes of either, most crimes have been either related to like money crimes, like transaction crimes, drugs. And usually in that sense, it's either by selling or by using to cope with what's going on in their life that they're not being supported with. Or a crime of survival against an abuser themselves. And so again, these women have been traumatized, have been introduced to the carceral system through trauma, and are continually being re-traumatized by the system.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm going to jump to follow up on a tack you were taking, Autumn, which has to do with not just the injustice for folks who are incarcerated, but the injustice of the healthcare system on a broader scale. So when I heard patients tell me who were currently incarcerated in the jail that the care they were getting was better than they got when they weren't in jail, what's wrong with that picture, right? I mean, the fact that women had difficulty accessing services that they wanted or needed in the world, not in the jail, which is how my patients often refer to it. Why is that? That's wrong. It shouldn't be that a woman can come. I mean, I had one patient who really wanted to get her IUD inserted by my colleague before she was released from the jail. And she was going to court the next day, and our schedule was such that she thought she might go to court before and get released by the judge. And she said, I'm going to ask the judge to just keep me another couple of days till you guys can get me into clinic to put in my IUD. And that's what? So, I mean, we did a little pop-up family planning clinic that afternoon, and she got her IUD before she went to court, so that when she got released from jail, she had her IUD that she wanted. But there's something messed up about that whole system that I mean, the services that we provided, and this is one of the pieces I mentioned briefly before that I really want to focus on. It really, really matters from a structural standpoint, who is providing healthcare services. If that person is hired by the Department of Corrections or works for the correctional system, by definition, that's a conflict of interest. If it's a public health person that is working for either the department, like University of California, San Francisco, who works at the San Francisco jail, or LA County Health Department, who provides services at the LA County Jail, or the New York City Department of Health, who provides services. If somebody came to me who was currently incarcerated and said that a guard had beaten them up or had attacked them, I would have no problem going all the way up the chain of command to address that injustice. My paycheck didn't come from corrections, so I feel like the structure of the whole system, which is what you guys have already alluded to in terms of abolition, is not just within the carceral system, but without the racism and the inequity of the healthcare system outside the walls of the carceral system contributes to the injustice as well.
Can I add on to that, which is that, just to add on that, I totally agree with that. And I think it's really important to recognize that the same communities that are targeted for imprisonment are also the same communities that suffer high rates of premature death, right? And limited access to healthcare in general, preventive care or any care, emergent care, et cetera. And it, I had said earlier that prisons are institutionally violate the right to family. Prisons and the broader prison industrial complex and white supremacy and white nationalism function together in a very genocidal way, along with the privatization of healthcare and the lack of universal healthcare. When you lump all those things together, you have very small pockets of the country as supplying most people who are targeted for imprisonment, and also suffering really high rates of disease and dying from preventable illness. So I think it's, even if you take, for me as a lawyer, even if you take the most conservative definition of genocide in the United Nations sort of rubric, the most conservative jurisprudence of genocide, which is that a community is targeted for annihilation. If you think about the fact that folks are disproportionately targeted based on their race and their class, and a few other identifiable identities, right, for imprisonment, but then also systematically targeted for premature death in our society, it functions as a eugenic genocidal mechanism. And I don't use that in a hyperbolic way. It really does. And again, this is, for me, and I was so glad that Professor Feldman brought up that she took her direction from people inside. For me, really thinking about the genocidal mechanism of the lack of access to healthcare, universal healthcare, as well as imprisonment, thinking about that and thinking about it in a genocidal framework came from people in prison who I had the privilege of training up on international human rights law and letting them decide what direction to take it in. And so the work that I did around sterilization abuse was an extension of the research and human rights documentation that jailhouse lawyers were doing around those rights. And it really is important to recognize that people are experiencing these systems in that kind of genocidal way.
I don't know if y'all are seeing how much I'm nodding my head, but I know it's going to be sore tomorrow from the amount of truth that you are sharing here tonight. Our next question for you all as panelists is already something you're alluding to, but I'm going to go with it anyways. A primary argument against outlawing sterilization procedures for people who are incarcerated is that this will restrict those who desire the procedure from receiving it. Given that the carceral system can often act as a healthcare safety net for those who do not otherwise have health coverage, how do you respond to this argument? How do we ensure folks still have autonomy over this choice and can receive the procedure if they want it?
So I had to face that kind of criticism repeatedly in crafting legislation in California. And my response to that is a fewfold. And actually, I didn't say in my introduction, I'm one of the subjects of Belly of the Beast. And so I've been doing Q&As around that film around the country. And a lot of the Q&As I've been doing have been to medical schools, residency programs. I've talked to a whole lot of OBGYNs about this issue. And this comes up a lot. It also comes up a lot among lawyers who are really concerned with defending Roe v. Wade right now and abortion rights. So I want to explain that I think that prohibiting sterilization for the purpose of birth control specifically inside prison is incredibly consistent with reproductive justice. And the reason it is consistent is that imagining that people have full autonomy to choice inside a prison setting ignores not a hypothetical threat of coercion, but a very real history of coercion that has taken place inside prisons and in other total institutions where people were systematically coerced into being sterilized, either without their knowledge or with their knowledge, but in a coercive manner. It sort of ignores power to argue that people have real autonomy and choice inside a prison setting. Certainly, people are asked to give informed consent to essential medical decisions on a regular basis inside prisons, right? But when you are in an environment where your every move is controlled by threat of force, like there's literally a person with a gun who controls when you get dressed, when you wake up, where you go to the bathroom, who you go to the bathroom in front of, when you eat, how long you have to eat, where you walk, if you ever get to see a doctor again, if you decide you don't want something done, right? All these things are controlled by threat of force. In that environment, your informed choice will never truly be autonomous. It will never be pure. And so the idea around protective anti-eugenic rules, like prohibiting sterilization for the purpose of birth control inside prisons, were set up recognizing that power inequity and recognizing that that's not an appropriate environment in which to ask someone to permanently give up a fundamental human right, like the right to have a family, right? So if someone wants to make that choice to be sterilized in the outside free world, it's a very different thing. And even there is coercion present. There's absolutely coercion present. It is a little bit different than when you're in a total institution and literally every move is controlled by threat of force. Mind you, police violence, other forms of lynching and racialized violence and class-based violence also control people by threat of force in the free world. I don't want to imagine that they don't. It's also a bit different than literally every single move you make. So anyway, for that reason, I've been a firm supporter of maintaining the anti-eugenic protections that prohibit sterilization for the purpose of birth control in total institutions like prisons. And then the last thing I want to say is that it's very consistent with abortion rights. If you were to deny someone access to an abortion, you are permanently forcing them to take on the role of parenthood and having given birth, whether you're just a biological parent or whatever. You can't take that back once you've given birth, all right? That experience is there. Similarly, if you coercively sterilize someone, you are permanently making it so that they can never be a parent, right? And to me, reproductive justice means allowing people the ability to choose whether, how, if, when they decide to have a family, right? And my goal is to preserve those choices into the future. And for that reason, I think that kind of a ban is essential. And it is valid to recognize the power inequity in that kind of environment.
Were you going to start, Autumn? Do you want to go next, or? So, yes, and. So again, coming from the perspective of a jail, not a prison, people who are in and out for short-term stays in the Cook County Jail, and that's my only experience. I was there for 9 years, but I haven't worked in other correctional settings. Using the concept, I'm thinking also of the concept of reproductive agency in addition to reproductive justice. So in other words, having the ability to set one's own reproductive goals for one's own life. A lot of the patients that I took care of at the Cook County Jail said, you know, doc, now that I'm clean and sober, I've had a chance to sit and think, I really do want that long-acting reversible contraceptive, that IUD, or that Nexplanon, which, by the way, is the newer version of the Norplant, Cynthia. It's only 1 insert instead of 5. And I feel like this is a responsible decision that I'm making. I want to be able to be with my kids when I get out. I want to be able to go for my substance abuse treatment, my mental health treatment, whatever. And I don't want another pregnancy to complicate my life right now. So I understand. I mean, again, LARCs, or long-acting reversible contraception, is a different ballgame than sterilization. It's reversible. That's the whole point, right? You remove an IUD and you can get pregnant the same day. Or a Nexplanon. True that you need someone to remove those for you, so it's not 100% your own agency, but it's close. So I had that perspective, and then I had women saying, you know, when I get out, I'm going to have to take 2 buses to get to the family planning clinic at Cook County Hospital. I'm going to have to find a babysitter for my kids. Can you just do it for me before I leave? Which the follow-up is still going to be in the same healthcare setting at Cook County Hospital, but I'd really like to get it while I'm here. And so there was this element of teachable moment. One of the things that reproductive activists work hard for in the general world is that women should be able to come in and ask for a method and get the method the same day, and not be made to come back and just, you come in, you say you want this, you get a test, a pregnancy test, you get your method. That was something that I learned from my patients in the jail, that we had to do differently because of this issue of coercion, because I don't want this patient thinking that maybe the judge is going to look more kindly on her if she gets a method of birth control, because it's going to be seen as responsible, right? That she's doing it for reasons that are not about her own reproductive agency and her reproductive life goals, but because it's related to her case or how she thinks her judge is going to react to her. And I really, that concerned me greatly every single time. But that she would have the option, I'm losing my train of thought, but I'm going to stop here and let Autumn jump in, but that the woman has the option to make a choice for herself without coercion on either side. This is a tough one for me.
So I am going to go ahead and jump in, and I really wanted to hear both of your perspectives professionally before I spoke, so I really appreciate that. But it just reaffirmed to me what I'd already prepared to respond with, which is this all boils down to choices, okay? And so although women may be incarcerated people are still owners of their body and still have a legal and a natural right to decide what is best for them. And I've seen, and not just when it comes to birth control and those methods, but I've seen women being denied for many different type of medical treatments, including birth control, but not exempt to, But I just want to cite the 8th Amendment, which says and does prohibit governments from imposing cruel and unusual punishment. And I cannot find or think of anything more unusual or cruel than to permanently make a decision for a woman based on a temporary situation. Again, most of these people are incarcerated for a short amount of time. And if their choice is to go forward with the procedure or not, it should be left up to them. However, it's not. And so because the healthcare system within the prisons, at least here in Minnesota, have a very limited, if any, means of accountability to the community and to these incarcerated women, it's hard to get any type of justice. You know, I have clients right now who are faced with very difficult decisions in a temporary situation. A client of mine will be getting out in 8 months and has a medical condition that is not being thought of as serious. And so for her sake, you know, I think about like what you said, Ms. Feldman, for some people, it may be more convenient to be seen and treated, but then there's so many others who are getting denied second opinions, who are being misdiagnosed, mistreated. Just the lack of accessibility to specialty care itself is just is pretty redundant in regard to any type of healthcare. So again, I just have to reaffirm that it boils down to choice and natural and human rights.
I wanted to sort of piggyback on that and just make sure folks are aware of how medical services are typically delivered inside prisons in the United States and under the federal system. And because people in prison have a constitutional right to some level of health care, does not mean that people have a right to all healthcare. The healthcare they have a right to have access to is only medically necessary care. Most institutions most states have rendered it illegal to spend state money on non-necessary care. So for example, in California, where we actually have law that says people cannot get access to non-medically necessary care, you can't get dentures if you have more than 4 teeth, and that certainly has a huge impact on one's health. You, until recently, could not get access to prostheses if you had to have a limb or a breast amputated. And you could not access birth control. So the only thing that was being at issue, and I just want to be really clear about this, when I started looking at the sterilization abuse, one of the ways that the sterilization abuse was enabled to perpetuate itself over a significant period of about 20 years was that the State Department of Corrections met and decided to redefine tubal ligations during labor and delivery as a medically necessary procedure. When you think about the fact that most of the people giving birth in the women's prisons are low-income women of color, and that the one thing that has been shifted from non-necessary to necessary, this luxury of reproductive care, is sterilization and permanent sterilization, that speaks volumes to the racist, classist, as well as just life unaffirming nature of these decisions, right? So I think the context is extremely important to remember, like extremely important to remember. And that was the context in which we set out to do this. And the other thing to remember also is that of 1,400 sterilizations we were able to identify in a 15-year period, that where the consent seems to be very questionable, many, if not all of those people were unaware that they were sterilized at the time that they were sterilized. So we were able to document cases where people were sterilized during hernia operations, where they had a cyst on one ovary and had both ovaries removed and were not even told that that was done. And then we interviewed hundreds of people who gave birth during that period of time, all of whom said they were asked if they wanted to be sterilized, several of whom said they were asked if they wanted to be sterilized when they were already sedated on an operating table having a C-section, right? Where they obviously cannot be in a situation to provide informed consent or even know what's going on around them. All of them told us that they said no. And of those people, we know that at least 250 of them were sterilized. So who were they? right? So I want to be really clear that we can talk in terms of hypotheticals about what people would want, but this was a situation that we were looking at where 100% was obviously coercive. It was mirroring what has now been disclosed by Don Wooten happening in an ICE detention center in Georgia. The allegations are very similar. And we know that there are 8 other prison systems in the United States that are continuing to do tubal ligations during labor and delivery, and they have admitted that they're not using special consent protocols. So this is a systemic problem. And I don't want people to lose sight of that when sort of couching the discussion around autonomy, because I want to make sure people really understand the potential for coercion in that environment.
Thank you for that clarification, Cynthia. And as a reminder, this is heavy stuff today, so take space for yourself and be kind to yourself during this discussion. Our next question is, again, thinking about how the carceral system often serves as a medical and social safety net for those who did not have health insurance prior to incarceration, which is estimated to be around half of those who are currently incarcerated. How does jail care and prison health care as a safety net, especially for reproductive health care, fit into the conversation around abolition?
I mean, I've already sort of put my 2 cents there and there. And the only thing I'm going to add is, like, I'm so glad that Professor Feldman brought up sort of how weird it is that we're trying to normalize provision of care in exchange for giving up liberty, right? I mean, that like, and actually it's that normalization that it really reflects how we have shifted away from being a social welfare state to being a punitive, punishment-oriented state, right? Where we are using prisons and jails as our solution to so many intractable social problems like hunger, like homelessness, like unemployment. Like when I bring up conditions in prisons and jails and problems there, people will say, well, what are people complaining about? At least they get 3 hots and a cot. I mean, it's sort of similar, right? Where like, oh, people should be thankful that they have roof over their head and that they're getting some gruel thrown at them, right? So I think, you know, the real thing we should be asking is, what do we do to get universal health care? What do we do to get mechanisms to create true safety without heightening police violence and other forms of state violence in our culture, in our communities? Yeah, and we shouldn't be sort of normalizing that. I do want to, because of who you all are as audience members, and I know so many people are really grappling with how do you get involved and how do you help in this situation with people who are inside. I do want to touch on the idea of non-reformist reform, which is a concept that Angela Davis talks about a lot, which is, you know, okay, so if you don't want to build up the institution of prisons, and yet you still need to keep the human beings alive who are inside those institutions, right? How do you do that? How do you not fortify this establishment and yet also help the humans? And that's sort of her concept, Angela Davis's concept of non-reformist reform. In my sort of litmus test of doing work in this arena has always been asking, is what I'm doing investing in people, or is it investing in the institution? And if it's investing in the institution, if I'm putting my resources into reforming the institution, I can pretty much count on it not reducing human suffering. If I am investing in the people and their capacity and their understanding about their own bodies and their ability to share information and help themselves and give them information and demand better care or advocate for themselves, if I'm investing in the people, then I feel like I'm keeping them alive. And I sort of liken it to, if we could go back in time, not that we want to, before the Civil War, certainly there were abolitionists then who wanted to keep people, who wanted to free people, but also who wanted to keep people alive so that the people who were enslaved would be able to see a day of freedom, right? But if you have limited resources, are you going to hand your resources over to the slave owners and say, here, some resources, keep your slaves alive? Yeah, no, you're going to figure out a way to help the slaves keep themselves alive, right? And to hold each other up and to strengthen that Underground Railroad and to figure out how to like do infrastructure, if you're going to invest in infrastructure of revolution, really. So that's always been my litmus test of everything I do, is saying like, am I working to make prisons obsolete? Am I investing in people? If I'm investing in people, am I just, am I really investing in the people, or am I throwing money towards those prisons? And that for me has been the litmus test that I use.
I really appreciate that, Cynthia, because I myself, in my position professionally and both personally, find that the best thing I can do is continue, one, to use my voice to try to advocate and bring awareness to what is going on from inside those walls, but also to focus on supporting and empowering the women who are behind those walls to be able to support themselves outside of there, and not to have to return to find that safety net that we're talking about. But also, like you said, it's a reflection of our society that it's necessary for people to feel more supported inside those walls than outside in our communities. And so that's a bigger issue for another time, but I just wanted to highlight that too. And I totally agree with everything that Cynthia said as well.
I'm just going to support what Cynthia and Autumn just said. I don't have more to add myself.
So now, what do each of you think are the most unmet needs within the carceral system in regards to sexual and reproductive health? And what changes are required to address those needs? How does that relate to what you're currently working on? Gonna start, Autumn?
I will. I have some ideas brewing, some that probably will come up after hearing from both of the ladies. But for me, one thing that I really find that is necessary is empathy training within the prisons and the administration. Some of these issues just come down to pure humanity and common sense. And to have clients who are shackled and strip searched after a C-section or delivering a newborn baby, it's just cruel, and unnecessary. These women have been supervised 24/7 during delivery and back and forth in transport. Some of these things are just unnecessary. So, to have clients who have medical supplies taken from them when being re-entered into the prisons, it just shows a lack of empathy. And I think that we as a society can get a lot further. Like you said, it's a choice between the social welfare and the punitive justice. And I just don't think that, I think that empathy training to start is one of the most primary things that we can do. And I'll pass it after this.
I mean, to me, I don't even want to think about the concept of like unmet needs within the carceral system. It's just unmet healthcare needs. And people are people, whether they happen to be incarcerated at that moment in time or not. But that person has the same needs for social support, for financial support, for substance abuse disorder treatment, whatever it is, where that those same needs exist when the person is incarcerated, when the person is not incarcerated. I mean, so to me, it's like I was looking at the California Department of Corrections website to try to figure out who was providing healthcare there before we started. And they talk about inmate patients, inmate-patients. And I looked at that, I said, that's wrong. You should not be talking about inmate patients. These are my patients as a healthcare provider. So to me, the whole for-profit healthcare system that's part of the prison industrial complex is a big problem because it's conflict of interest. I mean, I feel like I'm a broken record here, but there's a better chance for higher empathy, as you so rightly related, Autumn, if someone is in a nonprofit public health setting providing care for people. Now, there's still all the coercion still exists when the person is incarcerated. That doesn't necessarily exist when they're not incarcerated, but the provision of healthcare should be available across the board, regardless of where they're currently living. So, yeah. And one example of the lack of support on the outside was a patient who I diagnosed with breast cancer while she happened to be incarcerated, and she got out, she was going for radiation, and then I saw her back in the jail, and I said, "Why? What are you doing here?" She said, "Well, I knew I was going to start using cocaine again, and once I started using, I wasn't going to complete my treatment, so I intentionally violated my probation so that I could get back in the jail so you guys could bring me back over to finish my radiation treatment." What is wrong with that picture? That is horrible, horrible. So, I mean, those kinds of stories, we have to fix what's going on in the healthcare system to support people to get the care that they need.
Related to that, I'm just going to, I agree with what you both have said, and I want to add in that all of us have sort of talked about allowing people who are directly impacted by imprisonment to lead what they need and to define what they need. And that should not be a radical idea. And it is in the healthcare world too. I mean, it's, I can't even tell you, like I had some sort of weird, mysterious headache that went on for like a whole month recently. And I felt like I was being gaslit by every medical provider I talked to as if I was making the whole thing up. If I'm feeling that way as a person with like gratuitous privilege, right? Like just gratuitous privilege. Like, how is the average person who doesn't have that gratuitous privilege being treated in the healthcare system? And one of the things that really perpetuated the sterilization abuse that we were able to document and expose was an incredible level of paternalism within the medical establishment. So the only opposition we had to our efforts to curb the sterilization abuse in prisons came from ACOG, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And their rationale was really that they as doctors knew what was best. They knew when the best timing was to do a sterilization. They knew when it was best to approach a patient about it, and they should have freedom to do that. And a complete abdication of responsibility for the history of coercion of vulnerable populations by their profession, which goes all the way back to the beginning of that profession. I mean, the history of gynecology is a history of abuse of Black women. I mean, that's where, much research was done literally on slaves' bodies, right? So there was just an abdication of that reality, and a really shocking level of paternalism. And I'll add that on the legislative level, so away from the doctors, on a legislative level, when we started getting the proof that these abuses were happening and bringing the documentation to legislators, at first we would be approached or treated as if we were sort of heretic and or conspiracy theorist nuts, and then we would show them the data. And when we would show them the data, frequently the tone would shift, and suddenly the conversation would be something like, well, let's think about this for a minute though. Do those women really want to be having babies? Should they really be having babies? Maybe they shouldn't be having babies, right? And so there was this incredible level of paternalism that perpetuated this eugenic abuse. And so I think we're all echoing, I think all of us on this panel are echoing this need, which is a need to treat people who are in prison as intelligent humans who understand what they need, and to let people who are directly impacted by imprisonment to lead the solution making, and to help us figure out how to get out of this mess, right? And so I think, anyway, and the prison reform world is full of people who don't listen to, so it's all over the place. I think that's what we need.
Were you going to add something on, Autumn?
I'm just agreeing. Very good point. Exactly. I couldn't have said it better.
There's one other concept I want to introduce in terms of unmet needs, and this is one that Autumn, I think you exemplify, which is the peer role. And in this case, what I want to tell you about, which you may already know, is something called the Transitions Clinics Project, which is a project in, I think, 17 states to develop clinics for people being released from long-term incarceration to understand how to work the healthcare system now. And that includes, like, you know, people who haven't used a cell phone in a long time, and how to get apps on your phone, and how to make appointments for doctor's appointments or labs. And what the key element of the Transitions Clinic program is peer healthcare worker navigators, who are folks who have a history of formerly of being incarcerated, who then become healthcare workers and navigate with the patients coming out how to work this, you know, how to work within the system. And I think that this model, the community health worker approach, is the peer counselor, is highly relevant in this area as well when it relates to reproductive agency, reproductive choice, the concept of having reproductive life goals and making decisions about if to have children, when to have children, how many children to have. I mean, I had some patients who wanted to get their long-term contraceptive method in before they got out of jail because they were concerned that they might be returning to a domestic violence situation where they would be having coercive sex, or that they would be trading sex for money, having survival sex, and they didn't want to wind up with an unintended pregnancy in those situations. And again, that shouldn't have to happen within the context of a jail. But those women could have used the hand of someone to hold to help them understand that they did have the right to make these choices for themselves.
I had not heard of that Transitions Clinics project. I am not sure if that one exists here in Minnesota, but I would love to find a way to connect with them. So thank you. I will be looking into that.
And I just wanted to plug that people can do this kind of support of peers without being part of a formal program even. And some of the most amazing peer activists and peer educators that I've met in prison were fueled through pen pal relationships that they had with healthcare providers in the outside free world, who would help them understand treatment options, who would help them understand the latest and greatest in experimental medicine or treatments that were available, help them figure out how to help their peers advocate for things. And I can't express just how radical and amazingly powerful an act it is to just pen pal as a medical provider with people inside. And to share information just as friends, right? But as someone sharing information that you have access to, as someone who understands healthcare better. And that is so important. And, you know, and even if one is in one of the few institutional settings, correctional institutions throughout the country where you have autonomy between the correctional staff and the medical staff still have to worry about their green card in a sense. There are still boundaries that people can press and find themselves pushed out of this system or fired or having the whole program shut down and what have you. And so I also like to recommend that folks who might be in a situation like that, where you feel like your hands are tied for how you can advocate for people inside, is to make some friendships outside of work with people who do more grassroots organizing and find ways that you can filter information over to them. I can't tell you how many people over the years have, in a sense, been sort of underground whistleblowers who have filtered information to me and my fellow activists so that we could do what they couldn't do when they knew that there was a really grave injustice happening. And in fact, we heard about the sterilization abuses against the pregnant women in California because a whistleblower brought that information out from, and actually had attended a meeting for the California Department of Corrections where they publicly discussed with an agenda item the cost efficacy of sterilizing women in order to reduce foster care costs. And so that whistleblower was willing to share that information and did so in a way that has never been revealed, at limited risk to them. And it changed the law, it changed the world for folks who are facing that inside.
Yeah. I want to say my heart sang when you mentioned being a pen pal, because I did that as a young girl. I was a pen pal to inmates. There's plenty of programs you can Google and participate in, and that's just a great, easy way to get involved. But our last question, which y'all are reading our minds of what we're trying to talk about tonight. What advice do you have for people whose interest in this topic was sparked by this event and want to get involved? Do you have any resources you would recommend? And to everyone in the chat, do not panic and try to get all the chat links. We will send them out. Do not worry, but just to get on started.
If you guys don't mind, I'll go first. From my personal experience, I found that having these open dialogue conversations can spark a lot more movement than you think. Being just transparent about my experience kind of led me into this position, and I encourage anyone personally justice impacted, whether you've been incarcerated, you're the child of a person who's been incarcerated or a loved one, to speak about these things. Because like I said before, I hadn't considered the treatment of incarcerated women in reproductive justice from inside. I just hadn't considered it. And I think that because of how our justice system is in this United States, we often like to push those people, and those people being people who are justice impacted, out of our peripheral and not deal with it. However, we don't acknowledge the impact that has on our communities when they re-enter, because they more than likely will re-enter. And if they re-enter and they're damaged, they're traumatized, and they're broken, how does that reflect upon everyone around them? And so these issues really poses a threat to the greater general society as well. And so I find that having these conversations can be just the starter to a magnificent, transition. But also, if you're in the state of Minnesota, I just want to highlight and advocate that the current administration at the Department of Corrections has really been transformative. They've really been invested in being people-centered first. And so a lot has been brewing. And so I encourage you to reach out to the Department of Corrections if you have any interest in involvement. And also, there's plenty of volunteer programs. I know here at the Minnesota Prison Doula Project, we're often asking and looking for people to volunteer. And if you know anyone who is justice impacted, encourage them to become a peer support professional, because the more that we can regenerate that type of energy back into those who are coming home, the more they'll be able to regenerate it to others as well. And so those would be a few minor things that I think that just about anyone can do. Thank you.
I will just say, from speaking to healthcare trainees, from the perspective of learning about the health needs of incarcerated folks, identifying a not-for-profit healthcare system that works within a Department of Corrections that is separate from it and that has empathetic providers, and learning from them. I think you guys alluded in your question to Carolyn Suffren, who's an OBGYN that was in San Francisco and wrote a book called Jail Care, Finding a Safety Net for Pregnant Women in Prison. I strongly recommend her book to people, her perspective, and others like her in large public health settings throughout this country who really do see women or patients as patients, not whether they're incarcerated or not, and learning from them about how to best provide care to a vulnerable group.
Yeah, I feel like the numbers of ways that people can get involved and make a difference are just infinite. And really it comes down to sort of a life praxis of trying to reduce human suffering in whatever way you can. And I guess one of the things I've learned from working with people in prison, and specifically on this issue of sterilization abuse, I've been working on this literally for 20 years. And if you watch Belly of the Beast, which I hope folks will, 20 years ago when Kelly Dillon and I first met, who's the sort of subject of Belly of the Beast, and we met because I had learned that she was sterilized without her knowledge, and I had to tell her that, which is a horrific way to meet another human being. But if someone had told us that day that 20 years later we would have won reparations for people, we would have won the right to be notified, we also won a mandate that the state has to erect monuments throughout California at sites of large numbers of eugenic sterilizations, which decries the abuses of eugenics and says that the sterilization that happened in women's prisons in the 2000s was a direct result of that lost history. Like we shaped this, we changed it. And it was done with the help of about 200 volunteer human rights documenters who were imprisoned doing all the documentation and the work at the time. If someone had told us that at that time that was possible, I might have doubted it, and Kelly really would have doubted it. Kelly now is a health commissioner in Los Angeles and is shaping public health in all of Los Angeles now. What I've learned from this is that we all have the power to make change. And if we stick together and if we persevere, we can make amazing things happen. I don't care if it's not big, if it's small, we can do it, we can make things happen. Again, we just got to stick together and we just have to persevere. And so my challenge to folks around talking about Belly of the Beast is just to find something. I don't care if it's big or if it's small. Find a pen pal, challenge someone in your neighborhood's views and prejudice against people in prison, help someone get information about their health, do whatever it is, but just live that praxis of trying to make change every day.
Well, we are going to transition into our audience Q&A for the remainder of our event today. Please enter questions into the chat. Y'all already have, and keep them coming. And Kendall is going to ask our panelists. Take it away.
Awesome. We are right on time, so I appreciate that. Hello, everybody. My name is Kendall Lucero. I am a student over at UIC, and I'll be handling audience Q&A tonight. With that being said, I will kick us off with one question about how acknowledging that it's difficult to infiltrate the prison industrial complex and truly getting a sense of what's going on behind closed doors. How does that fact impact each of your work, including the process of making the documentary itself?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I'm terrible.
Yeah, no worries. The question is just like, it's hard to know exactly what's happening in prisons, like behind closed doors, like just the information gathering is hard. So how does that fact impact your work and how we move forward?
I mean, I became a lawyer specifically expressly because it would give me access to working with people in prison. My first day of law school, I was classmates at orientation with Ted Cruz, of all people. And we didn't get along. I was like, oh my gosh, I made the biggest mistake, like the biggest mistake ever. And literally the thing that kept me going through law school was the fact that I would be able to much more free of censorship, access people in prison, and be able to be an ally and an accomplice in some ways with people in prison and trying to win their freedom. So for me, that's been really important for access. And interestingly, there's a nationally recognized exception to the prohibition on the practice of law by non-lawyers for people in prison. And so people in prison are allowed to do things that typically only lawyers can do. And usually lawyers can access people in prison if there's a legitimate legal purpose to do so. And so I've always taken on the role of training up people inside to act as their own lawyers and to do human rights documentation and to create their own research and to find data and create data in a way that's less objectifying and more authentic. And for me, that's been a really important strategy, and has been really key in creating policy that I feel is truly authentic to what the desires are of people inside, because they were the people creating those remedies and creating the data to support it.
So I, like Cynthia, have probably been privy to have access to direct access to people who are incarcerated through my work and my personal experience. But I would like to, continue to highlight what Delaine and I forget who said about the pen paling. So a lot of how the Department of Corrections works, at least from Minnesota, and my standpoint of working with them, it's really hard to infiltrate those systems. So I am very adamant about having and maintaining and developing relationships within the DOC, the prison, and programming that as much as I can. But that's not easy, and I won't, act like it is. So a lot of information and just transparent, true, genuine, transparent information that I've collected has been by being a peer support professional and being able to advocate for their well-being. Sorry, I was having a little issue. So I will say connecting with organizations, nonprofit organizations that are work towards justice impact or justice reform. Also sitting in on legislative meetings and in community meetings that pertain to anything that relates to corrections and reproductive justice. I mean, I've sat in on plenty of hearings before I had any professional involvement, and connected with a lot of people that I now have are privileged to have those connections with, that has helped drive my work. So, sitting in community meetings, reaching out to other nonprofit organizations and directly impacted people. That's the best way I would say to go about it.
And that's certainly also what you just said is exactly also true for healthcare providers coming in who don't know very much about the carceral system, like myself. I mean, I had worked in nonprofits and community health centers and feminist health centers my whole career, and I didn't really know what even the difference between a jail and a prison was when I started. So I had a lot to learn. And I learned partly from community activists and organizations in Chicago, like the John Birch Association, like the Chicago Appleseed Fund, that are, activists and looking for alternatives to incarceration and working with folks who are currently incarcerated. And so I kind of learned from them along the way.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to move to a question about what do you imagine when you think about creating new systems of justice and accountability? And do you think that those solutions come from the legislature?
While we were doing research in collaboration across prison walls with people inside, documenting sterilization abuse and other kinds of destruction of reproductive capacity, we also were engaged in a process of talking about what justice would look like. And it was a really powerful kind of conversation to have with people in women's prisons, because so many people, if not all people in women's prisons, have experienced pretty horrific interpersonal violence that typically was never acknowledged by their communities, and they never had safety. And then they also were facing state violence frequently in prison. But then on the flip side was they were typically doing pretty long sentences for crimes of survival, right? So it was a really interesting conversation to say, okay, what would actual justice look like? Because it was very clear that our legal system was not it. And then also around this idea of like, well, what do we do about these horrific sterilization abuses we've unearthed? What in the world would justice look like for that? Like, what is that, right? And the themes that came up through those interviews, and those interviews took place over a period of about 6 years, were that a system of justice would have three primary components. One was a means for making sure people were truly safe and that whatever harm it was would stop. right? And one of the reasons that we pushed in our reparations plan or our justice plan around the sterilization abuse for mandatory notification that people were sterilized was that there was a sense that until people actually knew what happened to their body, the violence was continuing. That it was sort of like allowing state violence to just continue. The person was harmed because they didn't even know what happened to their own body. So that notification was a really important piece of stopping harm. A second important element was acknowledgement, to have societal acknowledgement of a harm that happened and acknowledging how grave a harm is, was seemed really important to folks to have noticed, right? And that was one of the reasons that we pushed for the state to create monuments. The state has to issue a formal apology for the contemporary sterilization abuse of people in prisons. That was actually the most controversial part for the legislators to agree to. Bizarrely, they really didn't want to do that. And we wanted that language in the legislative history. So that looking back for history, people will always see that there was an acknowledgement by the California legislature that what had happened was atrocious and that it had happened because of lost lessons, like that people had not remembered and taken care to make sure that eugenics did not continue to perpetuate itself. So the acknowledgement piece was important. And then the last piece was actually a combination of atonement and reparation. There was people felt that to try to make someone whole, or at least to do something significant to try to make someone whole was important. It was important for the person who was harmed. It also was important for the person who had done the harm. And this was something that came up a lot from folks inside, that they wished they had had opportunity for harms they themselves had done to actually atone for it, to be able to do something positive rather than just be isolated in a prison somewhere, to actually be able to contribute positively back into one's community. And they felt that the state should also have to atone for what it had done, and that atonement is not just punitive, it's actually a process of transformation. And so that's what that was the inspiration around really demanding compensation, that folks felt that the legislature and the powers that be in the state would only feel it if they had to pay something. They decided that was like important for atonement. There was by no means any thought that any amount of money would actually make people whole, right? They did feel like they wanted to be a significant enough amount of money that it would be a bite, and that it would be significant that at least, people would take notice of it. So the way it's structured is that there's $7 million put aside. There's 2 years for people to apply for reparations. At the end of the 2 years, the $7 million will be divided among whoever applies in that 2-year period, and their claims are accepted. Of the 20,000 people, it has to be divided between people historically sterilized and then people contemporarily sterilized in the prisons. Of the historic survivors, there were 20,000 people approximately that were sterilized by the state of California under eugenics laws. Only approximately 300 of them are still thought to be alive, because it was long ago and folks were vulnerable populations that had lower life expectancies. And then of the contemporary survivors, we know that we will not be able to find all of them, or that the state won't be able to find all of them. Of the 250 people that were sterilized during labor and delivery, for that subclass, we know that a disproportionate number of them were monolingual Spanish speakers, and that interpreters were not used in those sterilizations. And so we know that a significant number of them were probably deported once they finished their prison terms. So contacting them will be very difficult. So by no means do we think that this reparations will be perfect, right? Or that people will truly be compensated, but we did want to make it so that the state couldn't just not pay out if they couldn't find everyone. They have a set amount, they have to pay it out. It's been approved. And hopefully it will make some people feel a little bit more whole, or at least acknowledged. I talked to a 95-year-old gentleman who had been a survivor of historic eugenics in California. And when he found out that the state was actually acknowledging that the harm done to him when he was a teenager was wrong, and that he could apply for reparations now, I mean, he was just completely overwhelmed that finally at age 95, there was some acknowledgement. So I do think that it will have it will be felt as a significant gesture. And we felt that it was it was important for the state to atone in a significant way for what it had done.
Do either of our other panelists want to weigh in about what comes next and in terms of creating new systems of justice and accountability?
I mean, I really can't speak to this except to say that the fix for the carceral system has to be the fix for the overall system, the healthcare system, you know, much bigger structural change, revolution is actually needed. I'm going to throw a couple things in the chat though that are elements for those folks that are in the healthcare field that I think you need to be familiar with if you're going to work empathetically with vulnerable populations.
Thank you both for your comments. I just wanted to briefly add, someone you said, do you think legislator would be necessary? And I would absolutely say yes. The way that the prisons are ran here in Minnesota, each of the, I believe, 9 different facilities under the administration of 9 different wardens are ran like 9 different countries. And at this point, there are some rules that are only imposed at certain facilities, such as Shakopee being a no-touch facility for several years. That has been stopped now. But that was the only facility of all the 9 facilities that imposed that rule, no-touch facility. And to describe what that looks like, that is literally no physical exchange or contact by any means. I actually share this often because I can't even believe how heinously cruel it was. I witnessed while I was incarcerated, a mother whose 3-year-old daughter, handicapped daughter, had passed away. And when she was delivered the news, several of the women around her reached out to comfort her with physical hug. And all of those women were then brought to segregation, including the mother of that child, for sexual contact. That is something that is not imposed at any other facility. And I think it's particularly important for us as women or for women particularly to know that, because to go that, I went 2.5 years without any physical contact, except for when I would give visits. And those would be so brief and so awkward that I almost objected from even having it. You know, and that causes a form of trauma. That causes a mental, psychological trauma. And it's hard for people to reconnect outside of those facilities just by that alone. But yes, in order to have any type of change or movement, I've seen legislator definitely has to be involved. And then, you know, having case studies and actual testimonies like this is necessary as well, because like Cynthia said, a colleague of mine at the Minnesota Prison Doula Project was telling me how they actually started this work and got the contract work because of a research study that had been done by someone from the University of Minnesota. I think it was Dr. Rebecca Schlafer, if no one's familiar with her, about the medical conditions of women and the treatment of women. And prior to that, they pretty much shunned my colleague as if she was just making these things up, you know. So without the actual tangible evidence, studies, and research, they would have gotten anywhere. And that was pushed by the Minnesota legislature. So I do think that that's necessary. And until that is changed and how, you know, wardens can't even be elected out, you know, so there's a lot of hierarchy almost inside those systems that have to be broken down for us to be able to implement change. And I know, like I said before, the head of our DOC right now, he's really been working, Paul Schnell has really been working adamantly to create change, but he's expressed getting pushback from some of the wardens. So it's all a work in process, but I think that Community and legislator definitely have to be invested in that process.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to be mindful of time. And everyone, as Cynthia alluded in the chat, has asked amazing questions. So I apologize that we were not able to answer them all, but thank you so much for sharing those responses, everybody.
I think I speak for our virtual room, the audience, and folks who are probably watching this after the fact, that tonight was something special. It has been an honor and a privilege to hear each of you, Autumn, Cynthia, and Liz, speak about your experiences and your journeys in this field. We thank you for your energy, your vulnerabilities, and the passion that you have shared with us tonight. I also want to extend a thanks to all the people behind the Zoom veil in this webinar here today, the planning teams at the University of Minnesota, Sarah Benning, Chinenawat Alile, Monica Marcial Gutierrez, Taylor Lees, myself, and at the University of Illinois, Chicago, Joanna Paul, S.J. Doi, Kendall Lucero, and Gabby Massini. Thank you to the wonderful tech help by Jeff Johnson in the Division of Epidemiology and Community Health Office of Information Technology at UMN. And more than anything, thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight and being willing to hear and reflect on the difficult realities of incarceration. Thank you for opening your hearts to us and learning alongside us. We hope today can inspire action within each of you. We are planning to share more resources after today, as well as an invitation to fill out an evaluation of this event. Today would not have been possible without each and every one of you, and we hope to gather again sometime talking about how things have radically changed. Thank you for joining us tonight.